The humidity of the southern panhandle was a physical weight, a wet shroud that smelled of decomposing rubber fruit and the iron scent of rain-beaten earth. As Gwyn stepped out of his car, the silence of the plantation pressed against his eardrums. It had been 12 years since he last stood before this house, a sagging two-story carcass of weathered teak and stained concrete. This was the domain of May Crew Chan, his grandmother, a woman the village treated with a cocktail of reverence and soul-deep terror. To them, she was a healer. To Gwyn, she was a source of embarrassment, a relic of superstitions he had worked hard to outrun in the neon-lit clinics of Bangkok. His stomach lurched. The 10-hour drive had left him hollow, his vision blurring at the edges from exhaustion. As he lugged his bag toward the porch, his eyes were drawn to the San Pyong Ta, the humble eye-level shrine nestled beneath the gnarled roots of the ancient tamarind tree. Someone had been here recently. Amid the dead leaves sat a fresh krathong, a small banana leaf vessel. In its center lay a mass of sticky rice, so heavily saturated with a thick, dark red fluid that it looked like a landed heart. It shouldn't have been appetizing. It was a fly-blown offering to the wandering dead. Yet, as Gwyn stared, a sudden, agonizing cramp seized his gut. It wasn't just hunger, it was a demand. A primal, screaming void inside him recognized the scent of that iron-rich liquid. His mind offered a pathetic excuse. It's just chili paste, a local devotion, even as his hand reached out. He didn't use a spoon. He grabbed the cold, gelatinous mass, the red liquid staining his cuticles like a murderer's. The first bite was a revelation. The copper tang of raw blood exploded across his tongue, sweet and heavy. He swallowed it in great, desperate gulps, his throat working convulsively, fueled by a starvation he hadn't known he possessed. When the leaf was licked clean, the fog in his brain lifted, replaced by a cold, prickling dread. He turned and stumbled into the house, fumbling for the light switch. The fluorescent bulb overhead hummed, flickering with a rhythmic click-clack that sounded like teeth tapping together. In the bathroom, he threw himself at the sink, cranking the tap and splashing water over his face to drown the taste of rust. He looked up, expecting to see his own haggard reflection. The water dripped from Gwyn's chin, but the man in the mirror was dry. The reflection stood perfectly still, his hands resting on the porcelain, a slow, unnatural grin spreading across his face. The reflection's eyes were not his own. They were wide, amber, and bottomless, burning with the same parasitic hunger that had just driven Gwyn to eat off a spirit shrine. Suddenly, the bulb overhead gave a violent pop. Shards of glass rained like diamonds in the dark. Before Gwyn could scream, an icy, invisible grip clamped onto his jaw, forcing his mouth open so wide he felt the hinge of his bone groan. He was held there, a silent statue in the dark, as something cold slid down the back of his throat. The morning light didn't bring relief. It brought the evidence. Gwyn woke huddled on the floorboards of the main hall, his limbs stiff and his skin coated in a slick, grayish mud that smelled of stagnant pond water and old copper. His mouth was dry, coated in a residue so metallic he could feel it in his molars. When he pushed himself up, his gaze fell to his hands. Trapped beneath his jagged fingernails were tufts of oily black feathers and a singular hooked claw. The memory of the night was a jagged hole in his mind, a void where something else had been allowed to play. Stress, he told himself, his voice a pathetic croak in the empty house. Sleepwalking, a psychological break. He needed a tether to reality. He needed to see what he had seen before the sun went down. He had spent the previous evening taking test shots of the property, the sagging porch, the overgrown shrine with his vintage Leica. In the structured chemical process of photography, he hoped to find a version of the world that made sense. He transformed the small downstairs bathroom into a makeshift darkroom. He taped black refuse bags over the vents until the room was a tomb of absolute shadows, lit only by the low, arterial hum of a red safety lamp. The air grew thick with the acrid, vinegar-sharp scent of developing fluid. It was a sterile, modern smell, one that should have warded off the ancient rot of the house. He agitated the first print in the tray. Slowly, like a ghost manifesting from the ether, the image of the hallway mirror began to bleed onto the paper. In the photograph, Gwyn was standing in the center of the frame, his face obscured by the camera lens. But the reflection in the glass, the reflection had dropped the camera. The Gwyn in the mirror was hunkered down in a primal, limb-twisting squat. His jaw was unhinged, hanging at an angle no human bone could sustain, and his hands were buried deep into the chest cavity of a bloated black crow. The reflection wasn't looking at the bird. It was looking directly out of the frame, its eyes wide and milky, fixed on the man holding the tongs in the red light. The red bulb above him began to whine. Gook, gook. The sound wasn't coming from the walls. It was a rhythmic snapping of bone, vibrating upward from Gwyn's own throat. His jaw began to ache with a sudden, agonizing pressure, as if an invisible hand were trying to pull it from the socket. Every time the red light flickered out, Gwyn's body jerked. 1 inch, 2 inches. His arm, cold and unresponsive to his brain's frantic commands, reached out toward the workbench. His fingers closed around the rusted handle of a heavy film cutter. Next, a voice whispered. It wasn't a thought, it was a wet, rasping vibration that bubbled up from his own lungs, sounding like a woman who had died with blood in her throat. The red light died completely. In the absolute suffocating darkness of the sealed room, Gwyn felt his own hand bring the razor-sharp blade to his left palm. He felt the cold steel bite deep into the meat of his hand, slicing through the lifeline. He didn't scream. He only felt a sudden, sickening surge of saliva at the smell of his own hot, fresh blood. Gwyn threw himself against the bathroom door, his shoulder barking in protest as the rotted wood gave way. He collapsed onto the floorboards of the hallway, gasping for air that didn't smell of chemicals or copper. The setting sun bled through the cracks in the walls, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. His left hand was a mess of hot, wet red. He tore a strip from his shirt, binding the wound with shaking fingers. But the pain was secondary to the cold realization dawning in his chest. He needed his keys. He needed to leave before the sun vanished entirely. He scrambled into his grandmother's bedroom. The air here was stagnant, heavy with the scent of camphor and dried jasmine. In his haste to find his keys on the bedside table, his foot caught the edge of a heavy, iron-bound teak chest tucked beneath the bed. It slid out with a low, mournful groan. Inside, there were no heirlooms, no gold. Gwyn's breath hitched as he pulled out a yellowed photograph. It was a picture of a baby, but a strip of pa yan, a ritual cloth inscribed with complex swirling incantations, was pasted across the infant's forehead. He flipped it over. The handwriting was his grandmother's, a crabbed, spider-like scrawl. Gwyn, spare vessel, purchased from the orphanage. The world tilted. He wasn't her grandson. He was a container. He reached for a samut koi, a traditional accordion fold manuscript nestled at the bottom of the chest. The last pages weren't written in ink. They were stained a dark, crusty brown. The hunger is too great. I am too old to hunt, too weak to find the fresh meat it demands. Tonight, I will wake the boy. I will let him tear the life from my throat. To keep the line, he must swallow the seed. He must take the first taste. A door in Gwyn's mind, locked for 12 years, swung open.
He remembered now. He remembered a night when he was 10, the smell of incense thick enough to choke him, and his grandmother lying on this very floor, her neck exposed, her eyes wide and pleading, not for mercy, but for him to begin. He remembered the warmth of the blood, the way the village elders had watched from the shadows, chanting in a tongue that sounded like stones grinding together. He hadn't fled because of superstition. He had fled because he had finished his meal. Crack! Boom!
A violent thunderclap shook the house. Outside, the sky turned a bruised purple as the monsoon finally broke. Lightning flared, illuminating the hallway, and for a split second, Gwyn saw a shadow standing in the doorway. It was tall, impossibly thin, its neck elongated and twisted. Then, the power grid surrendered. The hum of the refrigerator died, the light in the hall vanished, total suffocating darkness reclaimed the house. Gwyn sat on the floor, his back against his grandmother's bed. He waited for the fear to take him, but it didn't come. Instead, a profound, terrifying peace settled over him. The wound on his hand didn't hurt anymore. It felt delicious. In the dark, the sound began. Crunch. He didn't realize it was his own teeth at first. He didn't realize he had lifted his bandaged hand to his mouth until he tasted the salt and the iron. Crunch, snap. The sound of his own finger bones breaking between his molars was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. A low, wet chuckle vibrated in his chest, a sound that didn't belong to a man from Bangkok, but to a hunger that had survived for generations in the shadows of the rubber trees. The rain hammered on the roof, masking the sound of Gwyn's feast. He wasn't Gwyn anymore. The vessel was full, and it was time to feed.